There are moments in life when you realize you know someone much less than you thought, and in my case, that someone was my own brother. My name is Daniel Carson. I'm 38 years old. I'm an operations manager at a logistics company in Portland, Oregon. And for 5 years, I opened the doors of my house to my younger brother, thinking I was helping family. I was wrong. I was being the biggest idiot in the world while he laughed in my face, slept on my couch, ate my food, and destroyed my life from the inside. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This story will show how kindness can turn into your worst enemy when you trust the wrong people. It all started in 2019 when my brother Kevin showed up at my door with a backpack and a story about how he'd lost his job in Seattle. He was 32 at the time, always the troubled son of the family, the one who could never hold down a job for more than 6 months, who always had an excuse ready for his failures. My wife, Rebecca, a high school teacher with a heart bigger than common sense, was the first to suggest he stay with us. Just temporarily, she said, just until he got back on his feet. I had my doubts, but when you grow up hearing that family is everything, that you always need to be there for your blood brother, you swallow your worries and do what feels right. So I said yes. Biggest mistake of my life. At first, Kevin seemed genuinely grateful. He helped with chores, looked for work every day, or at least that's what he said. He cooked occasionally, kept his space organized in the basement we'd turned into a makeshift bedroom, and even played with our children, 9-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler. The kids adored Uncle Kevin. He was the cool uncle, the one who played video games with them late into the night, the one who promised to take them for ice cream at the local ice cream parlor on weekends. Rebecca said it was good for the kids to have him around, that they needed that extra male figure in their lives since my parents had moved to Florida years ago. I wanted to believe it. I really wanted to believe I was doing the right thing. The first signs of trouble appeared after 6 months. Kevin still hadn't found a permanent job, just a few temporary jobs here and there that lasted a few weeks at most. He always had a reason. His boss was an idiot. His co-workers were jealous of him. The schedule didn't suit his needs. I started to notice a pattern, but every time I tried to talk to him about it, Rebecca would intervene. She'd say I was being too harsh, that Kevin was going through a tough time, that everyone needs support at some point in their lives. She'd always been like that, always seeing the best in people, always believing that everyone deserves a second chance, or a third, or a 10th. The bills started inexplicably increasing. Our electricity bill, which normally hovered around $150 a month, jumped to $280. The internet was constantly slow because Kevin spent all day watching Netflix and playing online games. Our grocery bill practically doubled. When I confronted Kevin about it, he promised to contribute as soon as he got a real job. Always the same promise, always the same cycle. I was spending about an extra $800 a month just to support him, not to mention the fact that he had turned our basement into a cave for a grown man who still acted like a teenager. My $85,000 a year salary was good, but it wasn't infinite, and I had a family to support, a $2,500 a month mortgage, and college plans to start financing for my children. Rebecca began to change subtly. She had always been a confident woman, wearing comfortable clothes at home, leggings and loose t-shirts, her hair pulled back in a messy bun after a day dealing with hormonal teenagers. Suddenly, she started dressing up more, even when she didn't have to leave the house. Makeup on Saturday mornings, perfume before dinner. That blue dress she only wore on special occasions, appearing on casual Sunday afternoons. When I commented, she laughed and said she was just trying to feel better about herself, that spending all day at home with a young child during the 2020 pandemic was affecting her self-esteem. It seemed to make sense. Everything always seemed to make sense until you discovered the truth. Kevin started going out more at night, saying he was meeting friends, networking, trying to find job opportunities. He would come home late, sometimes 2 or 3 in the morning, but always with a smile on his face and a story about how he had met someone who could help him. I was working extra shifts at the company, trying to offset the additional expenses, so I was often already asleep when he arrived. Rebecca always stayed awake waiting. She said she had insomnia, that she was worried about the bills, the pandemic, the children's future. She would stay in the living room watching TV with the volume low, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I believe my own wife? The financial situation started to get really tight at the beginning of 2021. Our emergency fund, which was around $15,000, was dwindling rapidly. I was working overtime whenever I could, but the company was cutting costs because of the pandemic and opportunities were limited. I suggested to Kevin that maybe it was time for him to look for another place to stay, perhaps with our parents in Florida. But Rebecca exploded. She accused me of being insensitive, of not understanding how much Kevin was struggling, of being willing to throw my own brother out on the street during a global pandemic. The argument was so intense that I ended up sleeping on the couch that night, while Kevin was comfortably settled in the basement that I had renovated with my own money and sweat. It was in June 2021 that I started noticing strange messages on Rebecca's cell phone. Not that I was the jealous or controlling type, but one night she left her phone on the kitchen table while she was showering, and it wouldn't stop vibrating. Messages from an unnamed number, just those quick previews on the lock screen that appear and disappear. I couldn't read the entire content, but I saw enough to make my stomach churn. Heart emojis, messages at 2 a.m., the word missing you. When she came out of the bathroom, I asked who was texting, and she said it was a friend from work going through a difficult divorce. Another perfectly reasonable explanation. Another lie I swallowed like an idiot. Kevin finally got a job at an electronics store in July, but it was part-time, minimum wage in Oregon at the time, about $12 an hour. He worked 20 hours a week, which came to about $960 a month before taxes. He promised to start contributing $400 a month to household expenses, but the first paycheck never came. There was always an excuse. He needed to buy clothes for work. His car needed repairs. He had old debts to pay. Rebecca always defended him, saying I needed to be patient, that he was doing the best he could. I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own home, like my opinion didn't matter anymore. The kids started acting strangely. Emma, who had always been close to me, began to distance herself. She spent more time in the basement with Kevin, playing video games, watching movies. When I tried to join in, she said she was busy, that I didn't understand the games she liked. Tyler started calling Kevin Dad Kevin, as if my brother was some kind of alternative father figure. This cut me deeply, but when I tried to talk to Rebecca about it, she said I was exaggerating, that it was just kids being kids, that I was being insecure. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was going crazy. Or maybe my instincts were trying to tell me something my heart refused to accept. The straw that broke the camel's back started in September 2024. I had a week-long work training in Phoenix. I didn't want to go. I had a bad feeling about leaving Rebecca and the children alone with Kevin, but it was mandatory and could result in a promotion that would increase my salary by $20,000 annually. We desperately needed that money. Rebecca encouraged me to go, saying they would be fine, that she would enjoy spending quality time with the children. She kissed me at the airport with that smile I'd known for 12 years, and I boarded the plane believing I was doing the right thing for my family. I had no idea I was leaving my entire life behind. During that week in Phoenix, something didn't seem right. The calls home were strange. Rebecca seemed distracted, always rushing to hang up. The children were never available to talk to me, always busy with something. Kevin. He had magically taken the day off work that same week. What an incredible coincidence, right? On Thursday night, I called home at 11 p.m. Portland time, and no one answered. I tried Rebecca's cell phone, straight to voicemail. I tried 5 more times over the course of an hour. Nothing. When she finally returned my call at 7 a.m. the next morning, she said she had taken a sleeping pill and hadn't heard the phone. Yet another perfectly logical explanation to add to the collection. I decided to come back a day early. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency, took the first flight on Friday morning, and arrived in Portland at 2 p.m. I didn't tell Rebecca I was coming back. Something inside me told me not to. I drove home from the airport with my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. Our street was quiet, a typical autumn afternoon in Portland, golden leaves covering the sidewalks, the smell of rain in the air. Rebecca's car was in the garage. Kevin's old car was parked on the street. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But nothing was normal. Nothing would ever be normal again. I entered the house through the front door, silently, using my keys. The TV was on in the living room, some cooking show that Rebecca liked to watch. I left my suitcase in the entryway and walked towards the kitchen. The house smelled different, a sweet aroma of scented candles that Rebecca only lit on special occasions. There were 2 dirty wine glasses in the sink, still with red residue at the bottom. My heart started racing even faster. I looked at the clock on the wall, 2:15 on a Friday afternoon. The children were at school. They wouldn't be back until 3:30. The house was too quiet, that kind of silence that precedes a storm. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step seeming to scream beneath my feet despite my efforts to be silent. I could hear sounds coming from our room, muffled voices, low laughter. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Part of me wanted to go back, down the stairs, walk out the door, and pretend nothing was happening. But the other part, the part that had been betrayed and humiliated for years without knowing, that part needed the truth. I turned the doorknob slowly and pushed the door open. What I saw in that moment is etched in my mind like a scar that will never fully heal. Rebecca was in our bed, the bed I'd bought at Costco 3 years ago for $1,200. The bed where our kids jumped on us on Sunday mornings. The bed where I thought we had a wedding. And Kevin was with her, my brother, my own blood. They didn't see me immediately. They were too engrossed in each other. It took a full 5 seconds for Rebecca to look at the door and see me standing there, my suitcase still making a dull thud as it fell to the hallway floor. The scream that escaped her throat was something I'd never heard before, pure terror and guilt mixed into a high-pitched sound that pierced the silence of the house. Kevin jumped out of bed so fast he tripped over his own feet, falling to the floor with a heavy thud. He began stammering apologies, trying to pull up his pants that were lying on the floor. Rebecca pulled the sheet over her body, tears already streaming down her face, saying my name repeatedly, as if that could undo what I had just witnessed. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in the doorway, my mind trying to process the scene, trying to find some alternative explanation for what I was seeing. But there wasn't one. There was no other explanation. My wife and my brother were cheating on me, probably for a long time, under my own roof, while I paid all the bills and worked myself to death to support them both. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally managed to speak. When the words came out, my voice was strangely calm, that frightening calm that comes before an explosion. I told Kevin to get dressed and leave the room. He obeyed quickly, stumbling as he picked up his clothes, not daring to look at me. Rebecca tried to speak, tried to explain herself, but I raised my hand and said a single word that silenced her completely. No, I didn't want to hear it. Not at that moment. Not while the image of them together was still burning into my retina. I went down the stairs after Kevin, each step heavy, feeling as if I were walking through thick water. Kevin was in the room, fully dressed now, with that beaten puppy look he always had when he was caught doing something wrong. He started talking, saying we could talk about it, that things just happened, that he never meant to hurt me. I laughed. a dry, humorless laugh that came out of my throat like broken glass. He never meant to hurt me. He was sleeping with my wife in my own bed, eating my food, spending my money, sleeping under my roof for 5 years while I worked like a slave to keep everyone comfortable. And he never meant to hurt me. What a cruel joke the universe was playing on me. I asked how long. How long had this been going on? Kevin hesitated, looking at the floor, at the walls, anywhere but me. I answered my own question before he could lie. Since the beginning, right? Since he arrived here with that backpack and that story about losing his job. He didn't lose any job. He left Seattle because he was running from something or someone and saw in me a perfect opportunity. A generous, idiotic brother with a beautiful wife and a comfortable home. Kevin tried to deny it, but I could see the truth in his eyes. I could always read my brother, even when he didn't want to admit what he was seeing. Rebecca came down the stairs, now dressed in a bathrobe, her face swollen from crying. She tried to approach me, tried to touch my arm, but I recoiled as if her touch burned. She began to speak rapidly, desperately, saying it had been a mistake, that she was confused, that our relationship had grown distant in recent years. I was always working, always tired, always stressed about money. Kevin was always there, always available, always making her feel special. As if that justified anything, as if that made the betrayal any less repugnant. As if I were to blame for working like an animal to support them both while they built their little love affair at my expense. I asked if the children knew. That question made Rebecca freeze completely. Kevin looked at her, then at me, and shook his head slowly. But I didn't believe it. Emma pulling away from me, Tyler calling Kevin Dad Kevin, the subtle changes in their behavior over the months. They knew. Maybe not consciously, maybe not completely, but on some level they knew something was wrong. I had failed as a husband in Rebecca's eyes, but worse than that, I had failed as a father by being too blind to protect my children from this toxic situation. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. I looked at Kevin and told him to pack his things and get out of my house. He opened his mouth to protest, to ask for more time. But I cut him off. No, there was no more time. There were no more chances. There was no more family. He had 30 minutes to take everything that was his and disappear from my life. If he didn't leave voluntarily, I would call the police and charge him with trespassing. Kevin looked at Rebecca as if expecting her to defend him, to ask me to reconsider. But Rebecca was in shock, hugging herself, trembling despite her thick robe. She realized at that moment that it wasn't just Kevin who was being evicted. She had destroyed our marriage too. Kevin went down to the basement and I followed him, not trusting that he wouldn't steal something along the way. I watched as he threw his clothes into suitcases, his video games into cardboard boxes, all the comforts he had accumulated over 5 years using my resources. He had more stuff than when he arrived. Designer clothes he definitely couldn't afford with his part-time salary, a new laptop, a PlayStation 5 that cost $500. Where had the money for all this come from? Then it hit me. Rebecca. She was giving him money, our money, money that should have been going to the kids' college fund, to our retirement, to emergencies. How many thousands of dollars had she diverted to her lover, to my own brother? When Kevin finished packing, it was almost 3 o'clock. The kids would be home from school any minute. I didn't want them to see this. I didn't want them to witness the complete destruction of our family. I hurried Kevin along, helping him load the boxes into his old car, that 2010 Honda Civic whose transmission repair I'd helped pay for last year, $1,800 I'd never see again. As he put the last box in the trunk, he turned to me and said he was sorry, that he really was sorry. I told him he wasn't, he was just sorry for being caught, and then I said something I still don't regret to this day. I told him he was dead to me, that he no longer had a brother, that if I saw him on the street, I'd cross to the other side. Kevin got into the car, tears streaming down his face, but I felt no satisfaction in seeing him cry. I only felt an immense emptiness, as if someone had ripped out my organs and left only a shell. As he drove down the street, disappearing around the bend, Rebecca came out of the house. She was crying uncontrollably now, begging us to talk, not to make rash decisions. Rash decisions? This wasn't rash. This was 5 years too late. I should have seen the signs. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have slammed the door in Kevin's face that first day in 2019. But now it was too late to have done that. Now I could only deal with the shattered present and try to build some kind of future from the rubble. The school bus turned the corner just as Rebecca and I were in the driveway. We had maybe 30 seconds before Emma and Tyler got off and saw their parents clearly in the midst of a crisis. Rebecca quickly wiped her face, trying to compose a normal expression, but her eyes were too red and swollen. I was better at hiding it. Years of corporate meetings had taught me to wear a mask when necessary. The children got off the bus with their backpacks, Tyler running towards me with a drawing he'd done at school, Emma slower, her precocious adolescence already making her suspicious of everything. They didn't yet know that their lives had changed forever that afternoon, but they soon would. Soon everyone would know what Kevin and Rebecca had done. That night was the longest of my life. After the children had dinner and gone to bed, Rebecca and I finally sat down in the living room to have the conversation I had been putting off for hours. She immediately began to explain herself, the words pouring out in a desperate torrent. She said it had started innocently, just late-night conversations when I was asleep, Kevin saying he felt lonely, that he was struggling with depression. She was just being a good sister-in-law, offering emotional support. But the conversations evolved, became more intimate, more personal. Before she knew it, they were sharing things she hadn't shared with me in years. And then, one night about 3 years ago, it happened for the first time. 3 years. Not 5, but still 3 whole years of lies, of continuous betrayal happening right under my nose. 3 years of me kissing my wife in the morning without knowing she was kissing my brother at night. 3 years of me working overtime to pay inflated bills while they turned my generosity into their own sick love story. I asked Rebecca where this happened. She hesitated, but I insisted. Mostly in the basement when I was working or sleeping, in our bedroom when I traveled for work, once in her car in the Target parking lot while she was supposedly shopping. Each revelation was like a stab wound. But I needed to know everything. I needed to understand the full extent of my humiliation. I asked about the money, how much she had given Kevin over the years. Rebecca went pale, her lips trembling. She admitted that she had been withdrawing money from our joint account regularly, small amounts she hoped I wouldn't notice. $50 here, $100 there, sometimes $200, when Kevin said he urgently needed it. Rebecca tried to justify it, saying that Kevin really needed the help, that he was trying to save up for his own apartment. But I knew the truth now. Kevin never intended to leave. Why would he? He had the perfect deal. Free housing, free food, extra money from his mistress, and no real responsibility. I was the idiot working to support their lifestyle while they laughed at me. I asked Rebecca if she loved him. That question made her stop crying for a moment. She looked at me with those brown eyes I had loved for so many years and said something that destroyed me more than the betrayal itself. She said she didn't know, that she was confused, that she loved me too, but in a different way. As if love were something you could divide and ration like slices of pizza. I told Rebecca I wanted a divorce. The words came out easier than I expected, as if my mouth knew what to do, even though my heart was still bleeding. She panicked, begging us to reconsider, to try couples therapy, to think about the children. The children. As if she had thought about the children when she was cheating on their father with their uncle under the same roof where they slept. I said she could stay in the house until we found a more permanent solution, but only because I didn't want to traumatize Emma and Tyler more than necessary. But we would sleep in separate rooms, There would be no more intimacy, no more pretending we were a couple. Our marriage had ended the moment I opened that door. The following days were a blur of forced normalcy. I moved into the guest room, a small room on the second floor that we used for occasional visits. Rebecca continued sleeping in our old room, even though she changed all the sheets and even bought a new comforter, as if that could erase the memory of what I had seen. The children sensed something was wrong, but when they asked, we said that Mum and Dad were going through a difficult time and needed some space. Emma, always more perceptive, asked where Uncle Kevin was. You said he had found his own place and moved out. She seemed disappointed but accepted the explanation. Tyler was sad for a few days, but soon distracted himself with his games and friends from school. The following Monday, I called a divorce lawyer a co-worker had recommended years earlier during his own divorce. Jennifer Matthews had an office in downtown Portland and a reputation for being ruthless when necessary, but fair. I explained my situation during a 1-hour consultation that cost me $350. Jennifer listened calmly, taking notes on her laptop, occasionally asking specific questions about our finances, property, and children. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said something that surprised me. She said I had a very strong case, especially with the proven adultery, but that Oregon was a no-fault divorce state, meaning Rebecca's infidelity wouldn't necessarily affect the division of assets or child custody as much as I'd hoped. This infuriated me. How could it not affect us? She had betrayed our marriage vows, stolen our money, and exposed our children to a toxic situation for years, and the legal system basically shrugged it off. Jennifer patiently explained that while adultery was morally reprehensible, Oregon courts focused more on the equitable division of assets and the best interests of the children. However, she said, we could use the misappropriation of funds as a separate issue. If I could prove that Rebecca had withdrawn significant sums from our joint account without my knowledge or consent to give to someone else, this could be considered dissipation of marital property, and she could be required to reimburse half of that amount during the division of assets. I spent the next few days immersed in bank statements, going back 3 years, highlighting each suspicious cash withdrawal. Rebecca had always been responsible for paying the small day-to-day expenses while I took care of the big bills like the mortgage and insurance, so she had free access to our joint account. At first, the withdrawals were small and sporadic, $40 here, $60 there. But as the months went by, they increased in frequency and value. There were weeks when she withdrew $200 in cash 2 or 3 times. When I added it all up, the total wasn't $12,000 as Rebecca had said. It was almost $19,000 over 3 years. She had minimized the theft even while confessing. Even now, she was still lying to me. I confronted Rebecca with the bank statements on a Thursday night after the children had gone to bed. I spread the printed pages out on the kitchen table, each withdrawal highlighted in fluorescent yellow. She paled at the sight of the physical evidence of her financial betrayal. She tried to argue that some of that money was for legitimate household expenses, groceries, or emergencies, so I asked her to show me the receipts. I showed her my own spreadsheets where I tracked every penny spent on groceries, gas, bills. Rebecca finally broke down completely. She admitted everything, not just the money, but other things I hadn't yet discovered. She had used our joint credit card to buy gifts for Kevin, clothes, electronics, even paid for a romantic weekend getaway to Cannon Beach last year when I thought she was at a teacher's conference. That trip had cost $200 on our Delta credit card. I remembered her returning from that trip renewed, happy, more affectionate with me than she had been in months. Now I knew why. She was radiating post-betrayal happiness, the thrill of having spent an entire weekend with her lover without having to hide it, and I had interpreted it as a sign that our marriage was improving. I was pathetic. The anger I'd been holding back began to boil over. It wasn't just about the sex. It wasn't just about the lie. It was about the complete breach of trust, about being made a fool of in my own home, about every stolen moment and every dollar embezzled. It was about looking back on the last 3 years and realizing it had all been a lie. Every smile from Rebecca, every kind word from Kevin, every family dinner where they sat across the table exchanging secret glances while I poured the wine. How many times had they laughed at me? How many times had Kevin thought about how clever he was for sleeping with the wife of his idiot brother who paid his bills? How many times had Rebecca compared him to me, lying next to me in bed, wishing I were her own brother? That night, alone in the guest room, I made a decision. This wouldn't end with just a quiet, civilized divorce. Kevin and Rebecca had chosen to humiliate me, to use me, to betray me in the worst possible way. Now they would face the consequences. Not just legal or financial consequences, but social ones. Our family, our friends, our community, everyone would know exactly the kind of people they were. I wasn't going to protect them from the shame they deserved. I had protected Kevin his whole life, always covering up his mistakes, always making excuses for his behavior. Not anymore. It was time for the world to see who Kevin and Rebecca really were, and I knew exactly where to start. The next morning, Friday, I called my mother in Florida. She answered excitedly, always happy to hear from me, asking about the children and when we were going to visit them. I took a deep breath and said I needed to tell her something that would hurt her, but that she needed to know. I told her everything. The betrayal, the years of lies, the stolen money, Kevin being kicked out. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard my mother start to cry. She said she couldn't believe it, that Kevin had his problems but would never do something like that there must be some misunderstanding. But when I explained the details, when I told her about catching them in bed, about the bank statements, about Rebecca's confessions, even my mother couldn't deny the truth. Her youngest son had destroyed her oldest son's family, and she would have to live with that. My father picked up the phone next. Unlike my mother, he didn't cry. He was silent for a long moment, then said 5 words that made me realize that at least someone was on my side. He said, "You did the right thing." My father, a Vietnam veteran who had always preached family loyalty above all else, was telling me that kicking Kevin out had been justified. He said he was ashamed of the son he had raised, that Kevin had always been too spoiled, always shirking responsibility, always expecting others to clean up his messes. But this was unforgivable. My father said that Kevin was no longer welcome in their Florida home. That while I and the children would always have a home with them, Kevin had burned that bridge forever. I thanked my father, and for the first time in days, I felt that maybe I would survive this after all. The news spread through the family like wildfire. My mother, despite her grief, called my aunts and uncles, my cousins, telling them what Kevin had done. Some didn't believe it at first. Kevin had always been charismatic, always knew how to make people like him. But when the details started to circulate, when it became clear that it wasn't just a rumor or a misunderstanding, the family turned their backs on him. My Aunt Susan, who had always had a special affection for Kevin, called me crying, apologizing for all the time she had pressured me to be more understanding with my brother over the years. My cousin Mike, who lived in Seattle and occasionally met Kevin for a beer, texted me saying he never wanted to see his face again. The family was taking a stand, and for the first time in their lives, Kevin wasn't the favorite. Rebecca, on the other hand, was desperate to control the narrative. She begged me not to tell her parents what had happened, at least not yet, not the way I was planning. She said she wanted to tell them herself, in her own way, to minimize the damage. I laughed in her face. Minimize the damage? She wanted to minimize the damage now? After 3 years of downplaying our marriage, downplaying her vows, downplaying the well-being of our children? No, I wasn't going to grant her that courtesy. I called her in-laws one Saturday afternoon while Rebecca was taking the children to a school activity. Linda and Robert Patterson were decent, conservative, practicing Catholics who had raised Rebecca with traditional values, or at least they thought they had. Linda answered the phone with her usual cheerful voice, asking how her grandchildren were. She said the children were fine, but that I needed to talk to her and Robert about something serious. I asked her to put it on speakerphone. When Robert came on the line, I told him everything exactly as it had happened, without softening the blow, without sparing any details. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda started crying, murmuring, "Oh my God," repeatedly. Robert, a man of few words who always treated me like the son he never had, simply asked what I needed. I said I was going through a divorce, that I would need help with the children during the transition, and that they deserved to know the kind of person their daughter had become. Robert said something that surprised me. He said he always thought Rebecca had married too young, at 22, that maybe she hadn't had time to figure out who she really was before making life commitments. But that didn't excuse what she had done. Betrayal was betrayal, and hurting family was unforgivable. Linda, still crying, asked about my brother. When I explained that Kevin was the one Rebecca had betrayed with me, their shock intensified even more. They knew Kevin. He had dined at their house dozens of times over the years, always charming, always grateful for their hospitality. Knowing that he had abused the trust of the whole family in this way enraged them. Robert said they would come to Portland next week, that they wanted to see the children and talk to Rebecca in person. Meanwhile, Kevin was desperately trying to contact me, blocked calls, ignored text messages, even a letter left in my mailbox that I threw in the trash unopened. He was also trying to talk to our mother, to other family members, but the doors were closing one by one. I found out through my cousin Rachel that Kevin was living in his car, parking in different places every night, showering at the Planet Fitness gym, which cost $10 a month. Part of me, a very small and pathetic part, felt sorry for him, but then I remembered the image of him in my bed with my wife, and any compassion evaporated instantly. The situation at work was becoming unbearable. I was distracted, making small but frequent mistakes, arriving late because I couldn't sleep properly at night. My supervisor, Greg, called me into his office on a Tuesday and asked if everything was all right. Greg was a good guy. We had worked together for 7 years, and he could see that something was very wrong. I hesitated, but then decided that hiding it wasn't doing anyone any good. I told him a summary: wife cheating with my brother, divorce underway, life imploding. Greg was visibly shocked, but also understanding. He offered 2 weeks of paid leave, saying I needed to deal with my personal life before it permanently affected my career. I used this time to delve into the divorce preparations. Jennifer Matthews was building a solid case. Beyond the $18,750 dissipation of marital property, we were arguing for primary custody of the children based on Rebecca's questionable judgment and the instability she had brought to family life. Oregon favored joint custody in most cases, but Jennifer believed we could get at least a 60-40 in my favor, especially if Rebecca didn't contest too much to avoid all the dirty details being exposed in open court. Oregon law also required that any custody agreement consider the best interests of the children, and putting them in a situation where they had witnessed years of secret infidelity was definitely not in their best interest. Rebecca was served divorce papers on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a court officer as she was returning from work. She called me immediately, hysterical, saying she couldn't believe I was actually doing this, that she thought we'd have more time to try and fix things. More time? She had 3 years to fix things. 3 years where she chose, every morning upon waking, to continue cheating, continue lying, continue destroying our marriage. Now that the consequences were knocking at the door, suddenly she wanted time. I coldly told her she had 30 days to respond to the papers through her own lawyer. and that all communication from now on should be through our legal representatives or regarding urgent matters involving the children. The children finally had to learn the truth, or at least an age-appropriate version. Emma, at 9, was asking increasingly direct questions about why Mom and Dad didn't talk anymore, why Uncle Kevin had left so suddenly, why Grandma and Grandpa Patterson were coming to visit in the middle of the school term. The two of us sat in the living room one Sunday afternoon. Rebecca was crying before we even started talking. I explained as gently as possible that Mom and Dad were having serious problems in their marriage, that sometimes adults make very big mistakes, and that Mom and Dad would need to live apart for a while. Maybe forever. Emma wasn't stupid. She was 9 years old, but she was smart and observant. She asked if it had anything to do with Uncle Kevin. The question caught Rebecca off guard, her face turning white. I looked at my daughter and realized she knew, on some deep, instinctive level, that something inappropriate was happening. Children always know, even when they can't articulate what they know. I decided to be honest within appropriate limits. I said yes, it did have to do with Uncle Kevin, that he and Mommy had made bad choices that hurt Daddy very deeply, and that because of that, Uncle Kevin would no longer be a part of our lives. Emma processed this silently, then asked if it was her fault. That question broke my heart into pieces. I held Emma in my arms and repeatedly told her that none of this was her fault, that she and Tyler were the only good and pure thing left in this mess, that Mom and Dad would always love them, no matter what happened between us. Tyler, at 6 years old, was more confused than anything, not fully understanding the gravity of the situation. He just wanted to know if he could still play Mario Kart with Uncle Kevin. I said no, that Uncle Kevin wouldn't be coming to our house anymore. Tyler was upset for a few minutes, but then asked if we could go get ice cream. And so, with the brutal resilience of childhood, he moved on. Emma wouldn't be so easy. I saw in her eyes that something had changed, a lost innocence, a broken trust not only in Rebecca, but perhaps in adults in general. My in-laws arrived the following Monday. Linda was still visibly shaken, her eyes red from crying. Robert was furious but controlled, with that quiet anger older men cultivate through decades of discipline. They asked to speak with Rebecca alone first. I went to the kitchen while they locked themselves in the living room. I could hear raised voices, Linda crying, Rebecca pleading. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours. When they finally came out, Linda was comforting Rebecca, but Robert wasn't. He came to me in the kitchen and said that although Rebecca was his daughter and he would always love her, she had deeply disappointed him and Linda. They would support the children unconditionally, and they would support me in whatever I decided to do regarding the divorce. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I received a message from an unknown number. It was Kevin. Somehow, he had gotten a new phone number. Probably one of those cheap Walmart prepaid plans. The message was long, desperate, full of excuses and justifications. He said he never wanted things to get this far, that he was in a very dark place when he arrived at my house, that Rebecca had been the one who started things. That last part especially infuriated me. Even now, even after everything, he was trying to shift the blame onto Rebecca, as if he were the innocent victim seduced by his brother's wicked wife, as if he had no choice after 3 whole years of continuous betrayal. I blocked the new number without replying, but the message stayed in my head. Kevin was trying to save his own skin, rewriting the story to make himself seem less guilty. And it suddenly occurred to me that he was probably doing this to other people too, spreading his version of events, trying to regain sympathy. This couldn't happen. I wasn't going to let him control the narrative. I made a decision that night that some might consider extreme, but which I considered absolutely necessary. If Kevin and Rebecca wanted to play dirty, wanted to spread lies and historical revisionism, then I would play the game too. but I would play with the truth. And the truth, in this case, was a far more powerful weapon than any lie. The following morning, I created a document detailing the entire chronology of the betrayal. Dates, monetary values, evidence from bank statements, everything. It wasn't sensationalist, it wasn't emotional, it was just facts. A cold, clinical record of 3 years of betrayal and breach of trust. I sent copies to every member of the extended family, both on my side and Rebecca's. I sent them to close friends, colleagues who knew Kevin, even the manager of the electronics store where Kevin worked. Some might say it was petty revenge. I call it accountability. Kevin and Rebecca had hidden behind lies and secrets for years. Now there was nowhere left to hide. Everyone would know exactly who they were and what they had done. The reaction to the document was immediate and overwhelming. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from family and friends expressing shock, anger, and solidarity. My Aunt Carol, who has always been dramatic, left a 5-minute voicemail practically screaming about how Kevin was a disgrace to the Carson name. Work friends who occasionally went out for happy hour with me started avoiding any mention of Rebecca, treating the matter as if she had died instead of simply betrayed me. The community was clearly divided, and to my surprise, the vast majority was on my side. Even people I thought would be neutral were sending me messages of support, offering help with anything I needed. Kevin, on the other hand, was being socially crucified. I found out through mutual acquaintances that he had been fired from the electronics store 2 days after I submitted the document. The manager, a religious man named David, who always talked about family values, apparently didn't want someone with such questionable moral standards representing his store. Kevin tried to argue that his personal life shouldn't affect his job, but David was firm. In Oregon, employment is generally at will, meaning employers can fire employees for any reason other than illegal discrimination. Having an affair with your brother's wife while living in his house wasn't a protected class. Kevin was on the street, unemployed again, and this time without a safety net. Rebecca was dealing with the consequences at work. While she wasn't fired, the administration of the school where she taught was raising questions. Parents of students who were friends or acquaintances of other families in the community began to question whether someone with such poor judgment should be shaping young minds. The principal, a stern woman named Patricia Hendricks, called Rebecca into a meeting where she expressed concern that the situation was creating a distraction from the educational environment. Rebecca returned home from that meeting pale and trembling, saying she could be placed on administrative leave if the situation continued to escalate. She blamed me for spreading the document, for making public something that should have remained private, as if betrayal were a right to privacy. The next few days brought even more disturbing revelations. While organizing the divorce paperwork, I found a second cell phone hidden in Rebecca's bedside table drawer under some old books and chargers. It was one of those cheap Android smartphones you buy at Target for $50 with no contract. I turned it on and my stomach churned. It was full of messages between Rebecca and Kevin, thousands of them over 3 years, photos, videos, explicit conversations detailing every secret meeting. There were messages from Rebecca complaining about me, about how boring I was, about how I only thought about work and money. There were messages from Kevin calling her his soulmate, saying they should run away together, start a new life somewhere where nobody knew them. But what completely destroyed me was a conversation 6 months ago where Rebecca and Kevin were discussing the possibility of getting married after I was out of the picture. Kevin suggested they could make me look like an abusive or neglectful husband, create a narrative that would justify Rebecca leaving the marriage and getting full custody of the children. Rebecca initially resisted the idea, saying it would be too wrong, that I had never been violent or cruel, but Kevin insisted, saying that sometimes you have to do whatever it takes to get what you want. The conversation eventually died without a concrete plan, but the mere fact that they considered falsely incriminating me for abuse filled me with a rage I didn't know I was capable of feeling. I took the phone directly to Jennifer Matthews the next day. She carefully examined the messages, her eyes widening as she scrolled through conversation after conversation. After almost an hour, she looked at me and said, "This changed everything. Not only did we have irrefutable evidence of the extent and duration of the affair, but we had proof that Rebecca and Kevin had actively conspired to harm me and potentially deprive my children of their father through false accusations. Jennifer said this could be used not only in the divorce, but potentially in a civil suit for intentional infliction of emotional distress. She also suggested I document everything and consider a restraining order against Kevin, given that he had demonstrated intent to cause me harm. I confronted Rebecca with the phone that same night. She denied it at first, saying I was invading her privacy, that reading private messages was a violation. I laughed, a humorless laugh that echoed through the kitchen. Privacy? She was using a secret phone to coordinate a 3-year affair and potentially frame me for abuse, and she wanted to talk about privacy. I showed her the specific messages about the false abuse accusations. Rebecca went white, her hands trembling as she tried to form words. Finally, she admitted that Kevin had suggested the idea, but swore she would never have actually done it, that it was just fantasy, just idle chatter between lovers who knew they were in an impossible situation. I told Rebecca I didn't believe her. Why should I? She'd lied about everything else for 3 years. Every "I love you" she said was a lie. Every time she kissed our children goodnight after spending the day sleeping with my brother was a lie. Every time she looked me in the eye and pretended to be a faithful wife was a lie. Why would this one be any different? Rebecca collapsed on the kitchen floor, sobbing so violently she could barely breathe. I told her she was pathetic, that Kevin was pathetic, that they deserved each other. And then I said something I'd been holding back, something that needed to be said. I said I would never forgive her, never. Even 20 years from now, when the children were grown and all this was ancient history, I would still look at her and see the woman who destroyed our family for a better orgasm. The harsh truth of my words seemed to finally shatter the fantasy Rebecca had been living. She had been operating under the illusion that somehow, eventually, we could overcome this, that time would heal the wounds, that she could redeem herself. But there was no redemption for what she had done. There was no going back. Our marriage wasn't just over. It was completely annihilated, burned to ashes, and nothing would grow from those ashes. She realized in that moment that she had lost not only a husband, but the respect of the community, the trust of her parents, and potentially a significant portion of her time with her own children, all for Kevin. All for my useless, manipulative brother, who was probably already looking for the next vulnerable woman to exploit. That week, I obtained a temporary restraining order against Kevin. Jennifer presented the messages as evidence that he posed a potential threat to my well-being and that of the children, given that he had conspired to falsely incriminate me. The judge agreed and issued an order prohibiting Kevin from approaching within 500 feet of me, my home, my workplace, or the children's school. Violating the order would mean immediate arrest. Part of me hoped that Kevin would be foolish enough to violate it, that he would show up at my door drunk and crying, begging for forgiveness, and then I could watch him being taken away in handcuffs. But Kevin, cowardly as always, kept his distance. He knew he had gone too far, that there was no turning back. The financial situation in the divorce was developing in my favor. Rebecca hired her own lawyer, an older man named Thomas Brennan, who had a reputation for being aggressive but fair. Thomas called Jennifer proposing a settlement. Rebecca would accept a 60-40 split of assets and pay the $375 refund if I agreed not to sue for intentional infliction of emotional distress and not to use the messages about false abuse allegations in any future proceedings beyond the current divorce. They also wanted 50-50 joint custody of the children. Jennifer asked me what I thought. My first reaction was to completely refuse. I wanted blood. I wanted Rebecca to suffer financially, legally, and socially for everything she had done. But then I thought about the children. Emma and Tyler didn't ask for any of this. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of a prolonged and ugly legal battle. Against all my vengeful instincts, I agreed to the settlement with one modification. I would accept 50-50 custody, but I would have primary custody for school purposes, meaning the children would live mostly with me during the school week and spend alternating weekends and half of the holidays with Rebecca. This gave me more control over their educational and daily decisions, while still allowing Rebecca to be a present mother. Thomas agreed on Rebecca's behalf. The agreement was drafted, reviewed, and signed by both parties. In less than 6 weeks from the day I caught Rebecca and Kevin in bed, my marriage was legally over. 12 years of history reduced to a stack of legal documents and a signature in blue ink. The day the divorce was finalized, I sat in the courthouse parking lot for almost an hour, simply staring into space. I should have felt relieved, even victorious, considering I had secured favorable terms. But all I felt was emptiness. My family was destroyed. My children now came from a broken home. My brother, with whom I had shared my entire childhood, all those memories of playing basketball in the garage and camping with our father in the Cascade Mountains, was dead to me. And Rebecca, the woman I had loved since she was a 22-year-old girl with dreams of changing the world through education, had become a stranger, worse than a stranger, an enemy who had hurt me in ways I didn't even know were possible. But as I sat there in that parking lot, watching people come and go from the courthouse with their own legal dramas, I began to feel something beyond emptiness. Anger. Not the hot, explosive anger I'd felt that first day, but something colder, more calculated. Kevin and Rebecca had reached legal settlements with me, but that didn't mean they were free from consequences. The legal system had its limits on how much it could punish them. But the court of public opinion, that was a completely different story. And I was only beginning to tell my side of the story. The document I'd sent to the family was just the first chapter. There was much more to the story, and I was going to make sure everyone knew every sordid detail of what they'd done. 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I began to methodically rebuild my life. The house was too empty now, with Rebecca having moved to a small 2-bedroom apartment across town near the school where she worked. The children were with me during the week, and I had established a routine that worked. Breakfast at 7, school at 8, I picked them up at 3:30, homework before dinner, limited screen time, bed at 9. Structure and predictability were what Emma and Tyler needed now, and I was determined to give them that. But at night, when they slept, the silence of the house consumed me. It was in those moments that I found myself thinking about revenge. Kevin had completely vanished off the radar. No one in the family knew where he was, or if they did, they weren't telling me. My mother admitted on the phone that he had tried to contact her a few times, desperate messages asking for money, saying he was living in a homeless shelter in Seattle. She hadn't responded. My father was more direct, saying that if Kevin showed up at their door in Florida, he would call the police. Kevin's fall from spoiled family child to complete outcast had been swift and utter. Part of me felt a dark satisfaction in it. Most of me simply didn't care anymore. Kevin had made his choice, and now he was living with the consequences. My focus needed to be on the children and moving on. But moving on was easier said than done. I discovered I had developed what my therapist, Dr. Morrison, called hypervigilance. I didn't trust anyone anymore. Co-workers who were too friendly made me suspicious of ulterior motives. Women who showed interest in me were immediately dismissed as potential threats. Even long-time friends who offered help were viewed with skepticism. After all, I had completely trusted my brother and my wife, the two people I should have been able to trust more than anyone else in the world, and they had used that trust to destroy me. Dr. Morrison said this was a normal response to trauma, but that I needed to work on it, or I would become a bitter hermit. Easier said than done. Emma was having a hard time too. Her behavior at school had deteriorated, grades were falling, she was fighting with classmates and had episodes of crying in the bathroom. The school counselor, Mrs. Chen, called me requesting a meeting. We sat in her small office filled with motivational posters and stuffed animals, and she gently explained that Emma was clearly processing significant family trauma. Mrs. Chen recommended individual therapy for Emma, as well as possibly medication if the symptoms of anxiety and depression continued. My 9-year-old daughter needing antidepressants. Let it sink in. Because of Rebecca and Kevin's selfish choices, my little girl was so emotionally damaged that professionals were considering psychiatric medication. If I still had any doubts about doing the right thing by exposing them, they evaporated at that moment. Tyler, on the other hand, seemed to be coping better, but Dr. Morrison warned me that younger children often internalize trauma in ways that didn't surface until years later. Tyler had started wetting the bed again, something he hadn't done since he was 4. He had also become excessively clingy, panicking when I left his sight even for a few minutes. Nightmares were frequent, waking up screaming in the middle of the night about monsters and bad people. I held him, telling him he was safe, that Daddy was there, but inside I was seething. Rebecca and Kevin had done this. They had traumatized innocent children because of their selfish lust and lack of self-control, and as satisfying as it was to see them suffer socially and financially, it wasn't enough, not even close to being enough. It was on a particularly difficult night, after calming Tyler from another nightmare, that I decided to escalate my campaign. The document I had sent to family and friends had been effective, but limited in reach. Most of the people who received it already knew me, were already predisposed to support me, but there was a whole world out there that didn't know the story. And more importantly, there were potential future victims of Kevin who deserved to be warned about the kind of person he was. So I did something some called nuclear. I created detailed posts on social media, Facebook, Reddit, even LinkedIn, telling the complete story with names, dates, evidence. It wasn't defamation if it was true, and I had documentation to prove every allegation I made. The response was explosive. The Facebook post was shared over 500 times in the first 24 hours. People I didn't even know were commenting with their own stories of betrayal and validation. Some people criticized me, saying I was being cruel, that I should have kept family matters private, that the children could eventually see these posts. But the vast majority were on my side. Comments said things like, "You're a hero for exposing these people," or "They deserve to be publicly shamed," or "I hope Kevin never gets another relationship after this." The validation was intoxicating, but it also scared me a little. I had unleashed something I could no longer control, a narrative that now had a life of its own. Kevin finally broke his silence 3 days after the posts went viral. He created his own fake Facebook account and posted his version of events, portraying himself as the victim of a manipulative wife and an abusive, controlling brother. He claimed that I had been emotionally abusive to Rebecca for years, that she had turned to him in desperation, and that I was now using my superior financial position to publicly destroy them both because my fragile male ego couldn't handle rejection. The post was so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that I almost laughed. But then I started seeing comments from people who didn't know us personally, people who were willing to consider that perhaps there were two sides to this story. This couldn't be happening. I responded with evidence. Screenshots of messages from the secret phone where Kevin and Rebecca discussed falsely incriminating me. Bank statements showing the $18,750 embezzled, signed statements from family members confirming that Kevin had been supported by me for 5 years without contributing significantly. Letters from Rebecca's lawyer essentially admitting guilt by accepting unfavorable divorce terms without contest. It was a deluge of documentation that made it absolutely clear that Kevin was lying. The people who had questioned my version quickly changed their tune. Some even apologized for doubting. Kevin's fake account was deleted within hours, but the internet never forgets. Screenshots of his pathetic attempt at historical revisionism were preserved and widely shared. Rebecca called me that night, angrier than I'd ever seen her throughout this whole ordeal. She yelled that I was destroying any chance she had of rebuilding her life, that future schools would never hire her if they searched her name online and found this whole story. She said I was being cruel to the children by ensuring that when they grew up and inevitably looked up their parents' names online, they would find this public narrative of family shame. She said I was obsessed with revenge instead of healing and moving on. I listened calmly until she finished, then responded with a single question. Did you think about the children when you were fucking my brother in the basement while they slept upstairs? The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. After a long moment, Rebecca said something that really caught me off guard. She said Kevin was threatening suicide, that he had texted her saying he couldn't live with the shame, that he had lost everything, that he saw no point in continuing. She begged me to stop, to have mercy, not to have another death on my conscience. The manipulation was so obvious, it was almost funny. Kevin was using the threat of suicide as a weapon, trying to make me back down through guilt. And Rebecca was participating, probably because she knew that if Kevin actually did something drastic, it would be impossible for her to escape the association and public judgment. I told Rebecca that if Kevin was genuinely suicidal, she should call a suicide prevention hotline or 911, not try to manipulate me into protecting him from consequences he had brought upon himself. The truth was, I didn't believe Kevin was truly suicidal. He was many things, selfish, manipulative, cowardly, but he always had a strong instinct for self-preservation. This was just another game, another attempt to make himself the victim, to deflect responsibility. But a small part of me, that part that still remembered Kevin as my little brother, whom I used to protect from bullies at school, felt a pang of worry. What if he really did something? What if I woke up to the news that Kevin Carson had been found dead and I was partly responsible for driving him to this point? Could you live with that? The answer came faster and clearer than I expected. Yes, I could, because whatever Kevin did now was his choice, just like betraying his brother was his choice. He was an adult, responsible for his own actions and their consequences. Rebecca hung up on me when she realized I wasn't going to back down. I blocked her number except for a specific app we used to coordinate the children's schedule, ensuring all future communication would be documented and focused solely on parental matters. That night, lying in a bed that no longer bore any trace of Rebecca, no memory I wanted to keep, I realized I had crossed a line. I was no longer the Daniel who tried to do the right thing, who forgave and forgot, who put family above everything else. I was someone new, someone tougher, more calculating, someone who understood that kindness was often mistaken for weakness, and that sometimes the only form of justice was the one you create for yourself. Kevin and Rebecca had destroyed the old Daniel, but the new Daniel, he wasn't going to be destroyed so easily. He was going to make sure that everyone who knew them understood exactly who they were, and he was only just beginning. At work, my reputation had curiously improved. Colleagues who had previously seen me as likable but not particularly remarkable now treated me with a new kind of respect. The story spread through the office naturally, through gossip and coffee break conversations, but instead of seeing me as a pathetic victim, people seemed to see me as someone who had faced extreme adversity and come out fighting. Greg, my supervisor, offered me the available promotion, the one that would increase my salary by $20,000 annually. He said I had demonstrated resilience and strength of character, qualities they valued in leadership. It was ironic. My personal life was in ruins, but my career was finally taking off. At least something good was coming out of this nightmare. With the salary increase, I started to really think about the future in a way I hadn't been able to since that devastating day in September. The children would need ongoing therapy, and that wasn't cheap, even with insurance. The house needed some renovations, especially the basement, which I couldn't even look at without feeling nauseous. I decided to completely transform that space, tearing everything down to the studs in the walls, rebuilding something entirely new. It would no longer be the place where Kevin lived. It would be a recreation space for my children, a place of happy and new memories, not of betrayal and lies. The renovation would cost about $15,000, but it would be worth every penny if it meant erasing the last physical traces of that time in my life. The basement renovation began on a cold November morning. I hired a demolition crew recommended by a co-worker, 4 guys with sledgehammers and a willingness to destroy everything in the space. I explained to the team leader, a large man named Marcus, that I wanted every inch of that space ripped up and discarded, the drywall, the stained carpet, even the paint on the concrete walls. Marcus looked at me curiously, probably wondering why anyone would be so specific about a renovation, but he didn't ask any questions. He just nodded and said they would do the job. I took the kids to spend the weekend with Rebecca, telling them the house would be too noisy and dusty. When I returned and went down those stairs for the first time in weeks, watching the men systematically destroying every surface, I felt something close to catharsis. While the basement was being transformed, I received an unexpected call from a Seattle number. It was a woman named Jennifer, not my lawyer, but another Jennifer. She nervously explained that she had seen my social media posts about Kevin and that she needed to tell me her story. Apparently, Jennifer had dated Kevin about 5 years prior, right before he showed up at my door, claiming to have lost his job. This revelation left me absolutely furious. My parents knew. They knew the kind of person Kevin was. They knew about the credit cards, about the fraud, and yet when he showed up at my door, they didn't warn me. They gave me no indication that I was opening my home to someone with a criminal record. I called my mother immediately, my voice trembling with contained anger. She tried to justify herself, saying they wanted to give Kevin a second chance, that he had promised to change, that they thought with family support he could straighten himself out. I asked how much they had paid to clean up his mess. After a long pause, my mother admitted it. $8,000 in restitution, plus $3,500 in legal fees. Almost $12,000 to keep Kevin out of prison, and they never said a word to me. I told my mother something I didn't think I'd be able to say. I said I was disappointed in her and my father, that they had put me in danger by hiding critical information about Kevin, that their misguided loyalty to their troubled son had contributed to the destruction of my marriage and the trauma of my children. My mother started crying, saying they were only trying to help, that family takes care of family. I replied that family also doesn't let family blindly walk into disaster. That if I had known about Kevin's criminal history, about his demonstrated capacity for lying and stealing, I would never have let him cross my threshold. The hanging up hurt more than I expected. My parents, who had always been my rock, my example of integrity, had been complicit in the disaster my life had become. Jennifer from Seattle wasn't the only one to get in touch. In the following days, 3 other women contacted me, all with similar stories about Kevin, a college girlfriend he had swindled out of $2,000, claiming he needed to pay for a medical emergency that never existed. A roommate he convinced to put him on the lease, and then never paid his share, leaving her with $4,500 in debt. A former fiancée who discovered Kevin having an affair with her sister just 6 weeks before their planned wedding. The pattern was consistent. Kevin would find vulnerable or trusting women, exploit that trust financially and emotionally, then disappear when confronted, leaving destruction in his wake. I wasn't special. I was just another victim in a long line of people Kevin had used and discarded. I compiled all these stories into a second document, far more comprehensive than the first. It wasn't just about what Kevin had done to me, but about the pattern of predatory behavior that had defined his entire adult life. I attached statements from the women, all signed and notarized, willing to testify about Kevin's character if necessary. I sent this document not only to family and friends, but to local community groups in Seattle and Portland, to online forums about relationship fraud, anywhere where potential future victims might see it. Some people told me I was going too far, that I was obsessed, that I needed to let go. But how could I let go, knowing that Kevin was probably out there right now, looking for his next victim, his next confident woman to manipulate and exploit? I had a responsibility to warn people. Rebecca was also facing her own ongoing consequences. The school had decided not to renew her contract for the next school year. Officially, it was due to budget cuts. Unofficially, Principal Patricia Hendricks had made it clear to Rebecca that the drama surrounding her personal life had become an unacceptable distraction. Parents were complaining, students were asking uncomfortable questions, and the school's reputation was suffering by association. Rebecca had until the end of the current school year. After that, she would be unemployed. With the teaching market extremely competitive in Portland and her reputation now publicly tarnished, finding another job would be nearly impossible. She would have to consider a career change, perhaps even moving to another city. All because she couldn't keep her legs closed around my brother. Emma was finally starting to show some improvement. Therapy with a child psychologist specializing in family trauma named Dr. Sarah Chen was helping. Dr. Chen used a combination of play therapy and conversational therapy to help Emma process her feelings about the divorce, about the betrayal she vaguely understood had happened, about the loss of the uncle she thought cared about her. In one of the sessions, which Dr. Chen allowed me to observe through a one-way mirror, Emma drew a picture of our family. I was on one side, large and smiling, with her and Tyler holding my hands. On the other side of the paper, tiny and in dark colors, was Rebecca. Kevin didn't even appear in the drawing. He'd been completely erased from Emma's narrative about her family. It was sad, but also appropriate. Tyler was still having nighttime problems, but the frequency was decreasing. His pediatrician recommended a bedwetting alarm that would wake him when he started wetting the bed, helping to retrain his bladder. It worked most nights, although there were still occasional accidents. The nightmares were also becoming less frequent. Dr. Morrison said that children are surprisingly resilient when they have at least one stable and present parent. I was determined to be that stability for my children. They didn't ask for any of it. They didn't deserve to have their childhood stolen by the selfish choices of the adults in their lives. If I could give them some sense of normalcy and security, then everything I was going through was worth it. One afternoon in December, I was overseeing the final touches on the basement renovation when my phone rang. It was my cousin Rachel, the one who lived in Seattle and had connections with the homeless community there. She was calling to tell me she'd seen Kevin. He was definitely living on the streets now, thin and dirty, begging for money outside a subway station. Rachel had stopped to talk to him briefly, more out of shock at seeing him in that state than any desire to reconnect. Kevin had pleaded for help, saying he was desperate, that he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Rachel, with a softer heart than mine, gave him $20 and the address of a soup kitchen. But she called me because she was shocked at how far Kevin had fallen in just a few months. Part of me, a very small and ever-shrinking part, felt a flicker of pity. My brother was literally in the gutter, homeless and starving, a complete outcast from everything and everyone he knew. But then I remembered. I remembered him in my bed with my wife. I remembered the messages about falsely accusing him of abuse. I remembered the $18,150 stolen, the 5 years of his life being exploited, the traumatized children who now needed therapy. I remembered every woman who had contacted me with stories of how Kevin had used and discarded them, and any pity evaporated immediately. Kevin was exactly where he deserved to be. On the streets, alone, finally facing the real consequences of a life of manipulation and exploitation. I told Rachel she was very kind to help him, but that I would never do the same. Kevin was dead to me. He could literally be dying on the streets of Seattle, and I wouldn't lift a finger. Rachel was quiet for a moment, then said something that made me pause. She said she understood my anger, that Kevin deserved punishment for what he had done, but that perhaps there was a line between justice and cruelty, and she worried I was crossing it, that the person I was becoming, obsessed with revenge and destroying Kevin and Rebecca, wasn't healthy, that my children needed a father who could model forgiveness and move on, not eternal hatred and retribution. I told Rachel, more sharply than I intended, that she didn't understand, that she hadn't seen what I'd seen, hadn't felt the betrayal the way I had, that talking about forgiveness was easy when you weren't the one who had been destroyed. Rachel sighed and said she loved and supported me, but hoped I would eventually find peace. We hung up with a tension between us that had never existed before. That night, after the children went to bed, I went down to the newly renovated basement. It was unrecognizable now. Light blue painted walls, new laminate flooring, a play area for the kids with a large TV and video game consoles, even a small study area with desks for Emma and Tyler to do their homework. There was no trace of the place where Kevin had lived for 5 years. It was as if he had never existed. I sat on the new sofa I had bought specifically for this space and tried to feel something. Satisfaction, perhaps. Fulfillment. But all I felt was emptiness. Was Rachel right? Was I crossing a line between justified justice and unnecessary cruelty? Was I becoming as bad as Kevin and Rebecca, just in a different way? I shook my head, pushing the thoughts away. No, this was different. I hadn't betrayed anyone. I hadn't lied or stolen or manipulated. All I did was expose the truth, let Kevin and Rebecca face the natural consequences of their actions. If those consequences were severe, well, maybe they should have thought about that before destroying an entire family. I wasn't the villain here. I was the victim who refused to remain silent, who refused to let her abusers get away with it. There was power in that. There was justice in that. And if some people couldn't understand that, that was their problem, not mine. I slept that night in the renovated basement, testing out the new couch, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night without a single nightmare. January brought snow to Portland, a rare occurrence that transformed the city into a beautiful white chaos. The children were ecstatic, building snowmen in the yard, having snowball fights with neighbors. Emma was truly smiling again, genuine laughter I hadn't heard in months. Tyler was sleeping better, just one nightly accident all month. We were starting to look like a family again, albeit broken and reassembled in different ways. But the peace was fragile, and I should have known it wouldn't last. Nothing good in my life seemed to last lately. Rebecca showed up one Saturday morning unannounced, violating our agreement to always coordinate visits through the app. She stood at my door with frozen tears streaming down her face, trembling from both cold and emotion. She said she needed to talk to me, that it was urgent. I let her in only because the kids were watching TV in the living room and I didn't want a scene. We went into the kitchen and she collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Between sobs, she told me that Kevin had contacted her. He had somehow gotten a phone, probably stolen or bought used, and was bombarding her with messages saying they should be together, that they were soulmates, that it was all my fault for being controlling and vindictive. Rebecca was terrified. She said Kevin was clearly unstable, his messages alternating between declarations of undying love and veiled threats about exposing secrets that could further ruin her life. She didn't know what secrets he was talking about, but given Kevin's history of manipulation and lies, she was genuinely scared. She showed me some of the messages. They were disturbing, disjointed, the kind of text someone in the throes of a mental breakdown writes. One message said, "We were perfect together before your brother ruined everything. We need to disappear and start over." Another said, "You know what I know about you. Don't make me tell everyone." Kevin was spiraling downward, and he was trying to drag Rebecca down with him. I asked Rebecca what she wanted me to do. She hesitated, then admitted she wanted me to confront him, to use my influence in the family, to get him committed for psychiatric evaluation. I laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the kitchen. My influence. She thought I had any influence over Kevin, the man who hated me more than anyone in the world. And more than that, why would I help Rebecca after everything she'd done? She tried to argue it was for the children, that if Kevin was truly unstable, he could pose a threat. But the restraining order was still in effect. Kevin couldn't legally come near the children. If he violated it, he'd be arrested. Rebecca was alone in this. But even as I said that, a part of me recognized that a destabilized Kevin was potentially dangerous. Not necessarily to me, but to Rebecca, or worse, to any innocent person who crossed his path. Desperate people do desperate things, and Kevin had always been selfish enough to bring others down if he felt he was sinking. Against my better judgment, I agreed to make a few calls, not to help Rebecca, but to ensure that if Kevin was truly a threat, he would be restrained before he hurt anyone. I called Rachel in Seattle, explained the situation, and asked if she could locate Kevin and assess just how bad things really were. Rachel returned to me 2 days later. She had found Kevin camped under a highway overpass, surrounded by garbage bags containing his belongings. He was visibly worse, probably having lost about 30 pounds. His hair and beard had grown wildly, and his clothes were filthy. But most disturbing was his mental state. Rachel said he was talking to himself, monologues about injustice and revenge, about how the world had conspired against him. When she tried to talk to him, Kevin initially didn't recognize her. When he finally realized who she was, he grabbed her arm and began frantically talking about how Daniel I was the devil, how I had deliberately destroyed his life from the day he was born, because I was jealous that our parents liked him more. It was delusional, completely disconnected from reality. Rachel had called a mental health crisis hotline, and paramedics eventually arrived and took Kevin for a 72-hour evaluation at a local psychiatric institution. He was diagnosed with an acute psychotic episode, possibly exacerbated by drug use. Apparently, Kevin had started using methamphetamine, likely as a way to cope with the cold and hunger of the streets, or perhaps simply to escape the reality of his situation. The combination of trauma, extreme stress, lack of adequate food, and stimulant drug use had pushed him to a complete mental breakdown. Doctors wanted to keep him for longer than 72 hours, but without health insurance or family willing to assume financial responsibility, there was little they could do. Kevin would be released as soon as he was deemed no longer an immediate danger to himself or others. I received a call from the hospital asking me to list someone as an emergency contact for Kevin. They had tried our parents first, but my mother had apparently said they couldn't help, that Kevin needed to face the consequences alone. The nurse on the phone sounded tired and frustrated, clearly used to families abandoning relatives with mental health issues. When I explained my situation, that Kevin had slept with my wife and stolen from me, and that I had a restraining order against him, the nurse sighed and said she understood. I asked about options for Kevin after his release. She mentioned shelters, government-subsidized drug rehabilitation programs, community mental health resources. But all of them required Kevin to want help, and in his current state, he was refusing any assistance. Rebecca was relieved when I told her Kevin was in temporary psychiatric custody, but also horrified to hear about his condition. Despite everything, she clearly still had some feelings for him, or at least guilt about the role she had played in his downfall. I coldly told her that Kevin was no longer her responsibility, that she needed to block his number and move on with her life. Rebecca started crying again, saying she never wanted things to get this far, that she never imagined an affair would turn into all this. I asked what exactly she expected to happen, that I would find out and shrug it off, that our family imploding would have no real consequences, that Kevin could continue being a manipulative parasite indefinitely. She had no answer. At school, Emma was finally starting to thrive again. Her grades had risen back to previous levels. She had joined the art club and had even made a new best friend named Zoe. The school counselor, Mrs. Chen, called me to share the good news, saying that Emma was showing remarkable resilience. But then Mrs. Chen mentioned something worrying. Emma had written an essay in English class about betrayed trust, a seemingly innocent topic, but the essay was explicitly about an uncle who betrayed the family and a mother who lied. It was clearly based on our situation. Mrs. Chen wanted to make sure I was aware that Emma was processing the trauma through her writing, and that while it was healthy, we needed to monitor her to ensure she didn't get stuck in anger. I read Emma's essay that night. It was surprisingly mature for a 9-year-old, eloquent in ways that broke my heart. She wrote about how she used to think family meant safety, but now knew that even people you love can hurt you deeply. She wrote about disappointment, about how adults who are supposed to protect children sometimes only think of themselves. And then, in the final part, she wrote something that made me cry for the first time in weeks. She wrote, "But my dad showed me that even when everything falls apart, you can choose to be strong. You can choose to do what's right even when it hurts. And that's what real family does. My 9-year-old daughter saw me as a hero, not a victim. That meant everything." Tyler was having his own moments of innocent insight. One night during dinner, he casually asked if Uncle Kevin was dead. The question caught me completely off guard. When I asked why he thought that, Tyler shrugged and said, "That's how it worked in his cartoons. When people were bad, they disappeared and never came back." I gently explained that no, Kevin wasn't dead. He just wasn't part of our family anymore because he had made bad choices that hurt people we loved. Tyler thought about it for a moment, then said, "Okay," and went back to eating his chicken nuggets. The brutal simplicity of childish morality. People who hurt you go away. End of story. In February, the social media posts about Kevin and Rebecca finally began to lose traction. The internet had moved on to the next scandal, the next drama, but the damage was done permanently. Anyone who searched their names online would find the story, complete with documentation and testimonies. Future employers would see it. Potential romantic partners would see it. Their own children would eventually see it. I had effectively branded them with a digital scarlet A, a permanent mark of shame that would follow them no matter where they went. Some people told me this was too much, that I had gone too far. But every time I looked at Emma and Tyler, every time I saw the emotional scars that Kevin and Rebecca had inflicted on innocent children, I knew I had done the right thing. Rebecca was preparing to leave Portland. She had accepted a teaching position in a small town in eastern Oregon, near Bend, paying significantly less than her previous job, but at least it was a job. The distance meant she wouldn't be able to see the children as often, probably one weekend a month and a few weeks during the summer. Emma seemed relieved when I told her. Tyler was indifferent. Neither of the children seemed particularly upset about seeing less of their mother, which was sad but understandable. Rebecca had betrayed not only me, but their trust as well. Children understand betrayal instinctively, even when they can't fully articulate it. And they were doing what children do, gravitating toward the father who had remained constant and reliable. The night before Rebecca moved, she asked to have one last conversation. We sat in the same cafe where we had our first date 13 years ago, an irony not lost on either of us. Rebecca said she understood that I would probably never forgive her, that she had destroyed something that couldn't be repaired. But she wanted me to know that she was genuinely sorry, not just for getting caught, but for the choices she made and the pain she caused. She said Kevin had manipulated her, but that she wasn't apologizing. She knew she had made active choices every day for 3 years. She asked if there was any chance, perhaps years from now, that we could at least reach a place of civil peace for the sake of the children. I looked at Rebecca, this woman I had loved so completely, around whom I had built an entire life, and I felt absolutely nothing, not anger, not love, not even hate, just emptiness. I told her I didn't know about forgiveness, that it was a big word for something so completely destroyed. But I said that eventually, when the wounds weren't so fresh, maybe we could coexist politely at children's events, graduations, and future weddings. Not as friends, never as friends, but as polite strangers united only by 2 children who deserved better than their parents. Rebecca nodded, silent tears streaming down her face, and then she stood and left the cafe. I watched her drive away, heading towards a new life in a new city, carrying the shame of what she had done as permanent baggage. And I stood up, paid for the cafe, and drove home, where my children awaited me. March arrived with that false promise of spring that Portland always offers, sunny days interspersed with cold rain. Life was finally beginning to stabilize into a new normal. Emma was blossoming, her grades excellent, her confidence gradually returning. Tyler had completely stopped wetting the bed, and nightmares were now rare, perhaps once a month instead of every week. I was sleeping better too, although there were still nights when I woke up in the dark, remembering that moment, that door opening, that scene I could never unsee. But the good nights were beginning to outweigh the bad, and that was progress. At work, the promotion had come with new responsibilities that kept me busy and focused. Greg had put me in charge of an important project with a client in San Francisco, something that could lead to even bigger contracts if executed correctly. The trip was scheduled for April, a whole week in the Bay Area. I hesitated to accept initially, not wanting to leave the children, but Emma and Tyler encouraged me. Emma specifically said that I deserved something good, that I had worked so hard for them. Her maturity continued to surprise and break my heart simultaneously. No 9-year-old should have to be that mature, but here we were. It was during preparations for that trip that I received an unexpected call. It was a detective from Seattle. His name was Marcus Kowalski. He was investigating a series of robberies at local establishments, and Kevin's name had come up in connection with the investigations. Security cameras had captured images of someone matching Kevin's description, robbing several convenience stores and pharmacies, always small amounts of money and occasionally medication. Detective Kowalski was trying to locate Kevin for questioning, but he had disappeared from the streets where he was usually seen. Family and acquaintances were being contacted in the hope that someone knew his whereabouts. I told Detective Kowalski that I had no idea where Kevin was, that I hadn't spoken to him in months, and that, frankly, I didn't care if he was dead in a ditch somewhere. The detective was quiet for a moment, then said he understood there was a complicated family history, but that if Kevin made contact, I should call immediately. Kevin was clearly spiraling downward, and before he hurt himself or anyone else, he needed to be found. I agreed to call if I heard anything, but told the detective not to hold his breath. Kevin was clever when he needed to be, and if he was avoiding authorities, he probably knew how to stay hidden. The detective thanked me and hung up, leaving me with an uneasy feeling in my stomach. 2 weeks later, I received my answer about Kevin's whereabouts. He had turned up in Portland, not on the streets this time, but in something far worse. I received a call from the Portland police on a Tuesday afternoon. Kevin had been arrested for attempting to break into my house. Apparently, he had been watching the house, waited until the children were at school and I was at work, then tried to force his way in through the back door. A vigilant neighbor, the elderly Mrs. Patterson across the street, unrelated to Rebecca's parents, had seen the attempt and called 911. Police arrived while Kevin was still trying to force the lock, and he was arrested on the spot. I arrived at the police station 2 hours later, my heart pounding. The officer in charge, a sergeant named Bill Torres, explained that Kevin was being held in custody on charges of attempted burglary, violation of a restraining order, and that there were outstanding warrants from Seattle for the robberies. He wouldn't be getting out of jail anytime soon. Sergeant Torres asked me if I wanted to see Kevin, if there was anything I wanted to say to him. My first reaction was to refuse, but then I thought, maybe it was time for a final confrontation, to say everything I'd been holding back, to look my brother in the eyes and tell him exactly how much he had destroyed. I agreed. Kevin sat in an interrogation room, handcuffed to the table. He was unrecognizable. The handsome, charming man who had appeared at my door 5 years ago with that confident smile and bright eyes had completely vanished. In his place was someone skeletal, with sunken, empty eyes, grey skin, and teeth stained probably from methamphetamine use. He raised his head when I entered, and for a moment I saw a glimmer of recognition, perhaps even shame. But then his face hardened, and I saw only anger. He spat my name like a curse, Daniel, his voice hoarse and broken. He said it was my fault, everything was my fault, that I had deliberately ruined his life because I had always been jealous of him. I sat in the chair across the table, forcing myself to remain calm. I told Kevin that he had ruined his own life, that every choice that led him to this room was his own. He laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. He said I never gave him a chance, that I was always the perfect son, the successful son, and our parents always loved me more. That when he finally found something good, someone who understood him, I had to destroy that too. He was talking about Rebecca. He genuinely believed they had something special, that I had interfered in a true love out of pure cruelty. The disconnect from reality was complete. He had rewritten the entire narrative in his head, where he was the victim and I, the villain. I asked Kevin why he tried to break into my house. What did he expect to find? He was quiet for a long moment, then admitted he was looking for money, anything of value he could sell. But also, and this was more disturbing, he wanted to destroy something of mine. He wanted to get into my house and break things, burn pictures, leave evidence of the violation so I would know that nowhere was safe. It was childish and pathetic revenge, but also genuinely terrifying. Kevin had crossed from selfish manipulator to potentially dangerous. Drug use, deteriorating mental health, lack of any support system, it had all converged to create someone capable of real violence. I told Kevin he needed serious help, that he was clearly having some kind of breakdown and needed to accept treatment. He yelled that he didn't need anything from me, that he'd rather die in the streets than accept anything I offered. I asked about Rebecca, if he had been in contact with her recently. Kevin was quiet, then a strange smile spread across his face. He said Rebecca still loved him, that they talked every night. that she was planning to leave Bend and run away with him as soon as he was freed. It was obviously delusional. Rebecca had changed her number, blocked Kevin on all platforms. She was terrified of him. But in Kevin's fractured mind, their relationship still existed. It was still real and viable. I realized at that moment that there was nothing more to say. Kevin was beyond reason, beyond redemption, living in an alternate reality built of illusions and resentment. I stood to leave, but before I reached the door, Kevin said one last thing. He said that if he went to prison for years, he would use every moment of that time to make plans. That when he got out, he would find me, and he would make me pay for everything I had taken from him. It was a direct threat, uttered with cold conviction. Sergeant Torres, who had been watching through the mirrored glass, immediately entered and ended the conversation. Kevin was taken back to his cell, shouting obscenities at me as he was dragged away. That was the last time I saw my brother. In the following weeks, the legal process against Kevin moved quickly. With the Seattle warrants, the violation of the restraining order, and the attempted break-in, he was potentially facing 5 to 7 years in prison. His public defender, an exhausted young woman named Michelle Reeves, tried to argue diminished mental health, that Kevin needed treatment, not incarceration. But the prosecutor, supported by my testimony and evidence of Kevin's threats, argued that he posed a clear danger to the community. The judge agreed. Kevin was sentenced to 6 years in Oregon State Prison, with the possibility of parole after 4 if he demonstrated good behavior and completed drug and mental health treatment programs. Rebecca called me when she heard the sentence. She was visibly shaken, her voice trembling on the phone. She said she never imagined things would end like this, with Kevin literally in prison. She asked if I felt any satisfaction in seeing my brother locked up. I thought carefully before answering. I said I didn't feel satisfaction, but I felt relief. Relief that Kevin could no longer threaten me or my children. Relief that he would be forced to confront his actions in an environment where he couldn't escape or manipulate his way out. Perhaps in prison, with access to mandatory treatment programs, Kevin would finally get the help he needed. But honestly, I didn't care anymore. Kevin had made his choices. Now he was living with them. The trip to San Francisco was a success. The project with the client went so well that Greg said it would likely result in a long-term partnership that could double our revenue in the next 3 years. My career was taking off in ways I never imagined possible while struggling through divorce. It was almost as if destroying my personal life had somehow freed up energy that I could channel into professional success. It wasn't a trade-off I would have chosen. But since I was living this reality, I might as well take advantage of it. The additional salary increase meant I could start real college funds for Emma and Tyler, not just the modest 529 accounts I had before, but substantial investments that would ensure they had choices when the time came. Emma asked me one night, casually as I was putting her to bed, if she would ever see Uncle Kevin again. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that Kevin had been gone for a long time because he had made very bad choices. Emma nodded, thinking about it. Then she asked if it was wrong that she didn't miss him. My heart ached. I held my daughter and said no. It wasn't wrong that she was allowed to feel whatever she felt. That Kevin had hurt our family and she didn't need to pretend to have feelings she didn't have. Emma snuggled against me and said she was happy she still had Daddy, that as long as I was there, she would be okay. I held her until she fell asleep, silent tears streaming down my face in the dark. The truth was that through all the destruction, all the pain, all the betrayal, something unexpected had emerged. My relationship with my children was stronger than ever. They trusted me absolutely. They knew I would never abandon them, never choose my own selfish desires over their well-being. I had proven this repeatedly through the crisis, remaining steadfast while everything else crumbled. Emma and Tyler were resilient, stronger than I had given them credit for. They would survive this. They would even thrive. And I would be there every step of the way, ensuring they never doubted, not for a second, that they were loved unconditionally. That was my mission now, my purpose. Not revenge against Kevin or Rebecca, but to build something better from the ashes of what they had destroyed. A whole year had passed since that fateful day in September when I opened my bedroom door and watched my life implode. Now it was September again, the leaves beginning to turn golden, that characteristic Portland autumn scent that used to fill me with nostalgia. But this time, I didn't feel nostalgia for the past. I felt something different, something that took me months to recognize. It was hope, genuine hope for the future, for the first time in a long time. The wounds were still there, they always would be, but they were healing in a way I hadn't thought possible in those early dark days. Emma had just turned 10. We threw a big party at home, invited her whole class from school, filled the backyard with decorations and games. She was radiant, genuinely smiling, laughing with her friends. Zoe, her best friend, pulled me aside at one point and said that Emma had told her about the divorce, about the uncle who betrayed the family. Zoe said she thought I was the best dad in the world for protecting Emma and Tyler from all of that. Coming from a 10-year-old, that simple, honest validation meant more than any amount of adult support. Children see the truth with a clarity that adults lose somewhere along the way. Tyler was thriving in ways that constantly surprised me. He had joined the school's football team, something he never would have done before when our house was filled with tension and unspoken secrets. Now he was confident, assertive, scoring goals and receiving high fives from teammates. His teacher, Mr. Williams, stopped me after a game to say that Tyler had shown remarkable growth, that there was a light in him now that wasn't there the previous year. I didn't tell Mr. Williams the specific reason for this transformation, but I appreciated the observation. My children were not only surviving the trauma, they were flourishing despite it. That was all that mattered. Rebecca had been visiting once a month, driving the 3-hour drive from Bend to Portland on a Saturday, spending the day with the children, then returning that same evening. That was all her schedule and finances allowed. The visits were cordial, but distant. The children saw her more as a favorite aunt than as a mother now, a sad but inevitable change. Rebecca tried to rebuild the connection, but 3 hours once a month simply wasn't enough to undo months of broken trust. She had sent Emma birthday cards with a long letter apologizing, explaining that adults sometimes make terrible mistakes, pleading for understanding. Emma read the letter, folded it carefully, and put it away in a drawer without comment. She wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't going to force her. As for me, I had started to consider dating again, not actively seeking it, but open to the possibility. A co-worker named Sarah had shown interest, a project manager a few years younger than me, divorced with no children. We had gone out to lunch a few days, easy and comfortable conversations about work and life. She knew my story, everyone in the office knew, but she didn't treat me like a victim or a failed project. She saw me as a whole person, capable and strong. When she suggested a real dinner, a proper date, I said yes. It was scary, the idea of trusting someone again in that way, but Dr. Morrison reminded me that not everyone is Kevin or Rebecca, that there were good people in the world, and I deserved to find happiness again. Kevin was serving his sentence at Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, about an hour from Portland. I had received a few letters from him in the first few months, incoherent ramblings alternating between pleas for forgiveness and accusations that I had intentionally ruined his life. I didn't answer any of them. Eventually, the letters stopped. My mother told me that she and my father had visited Kevin once, more out of parental obligation than any real desire. They said he was participating in mandatory drug treatment programs, that he seemed more lucid than he had been in months, But he still wasn't taking real responsibility for his actions, still blaming others, especially me, for his problems. My mother asked if I would ever visit Kevin. I said no. There was nothing more to say. The social media posts eventually dropped out of the first search result when you looked for our names, but they were still there, buried in later pages, waiting for anyone determined enough to find them. I had considered deleting them, but decided against it. They served a purpose. Any future employer of Rebecca's, any potential romantic partner of Kevin's after his release, they deserved to know the truth. Some people told me this was cruel, that everyone deserves second chances. But I disagreed. Second chances are earned through genuine responsibility and demonstrated change, not automatically granted just because time has passed. Kevin and Rebecca hadn't earned second chances. Maybe someday, but not yet. Financially, I was in a better position than ever. The Portland community had largely moved on too. New scandals, new dramas had captured attention. Occasionally someone would recognize me at Target or Costco, give me a sympathetic nod or a thumbs up of solidarity. But for the most part, I was just Daniel again, a single father shopping with 2 children, living my life exactly as I wanted. The public vengeance had served its purpose, creating accountability and warning potential future victims about Kevin. But I wasn't defined by it. I was defined by how I got back on my feet, how I protected my children, how I rebuilt something good from the ruins. Dr. Morrison, in our most recent session, asked if I had achieved closure. It was a word I heard frequently, but never fully understood. Closure implies that something is closed, finished, resolved. But betrayal doesn't work that way. You don't close the door on it and move on as if it never happened. The scars remain. The moments of doubt remain. The hypervigilance remains, though diminished. What you do achieve, if you're lucky, is integration. You integrate the experience into your life narrative, learn from it, grow despite it. I told this to Dr. Morrison and he smiled. He said that was a very mature understanding of trauma and recovery, that I had progressed more than most people manage to. Rebecca called me one Sunday afternoon in October, an unscheduled call outside of our usual parenting arrangements. Her voice was strange, hesitant. She said she needed to tell me something I deserved to know. Kevin had tried to contact her from prison, repeatedly collecting calls that she had refused. But then he managed to get another inmate to call her from a smuggled phone, catching her off guard. Kevin had said things during that call that scared her. He said he still loved her, that when he got out in 4 years, they would pick up where they left off, that I would pay for keeping them apart. Rebecca had immediately reported the call to prison authorities, and Kevin was now in solitary confinement as punishment, with the possibility of additional time added to his sentence. I thanked Rebecca for telling me, though I wasn't particularly surprised. Kevin had demonstrated that he was delusional and potentially dangerous. Having that confirmed again simply reinforced that keeping him out of our lives was the only safe option. Rebecca then said something unexpected. She apologized, truly this time, without justifications or ifs or buts. She said she had spent the year in intensive therapy, working through why she made the choices she did, confronting her own character flaws. That she understood now that Kevin had manipulated her, but that she had allowed herself to be manipulated because she was avoiding her own problems in our marriage instead of communicating them honestly. That she had failed me, the children, herself. And that although she knew I would never forgive her, she needed me to know that she was genuinely, deeply sorry. I stayed quiet for a long time after Rebecca finished. Part of me wanted to reject the apology, throw it back in her face, list once again all the ways she had destroyed me. But I was tired of the anger, tired of the resentment, tired of carrying the weight of hatred. So I said something that surprised me as much as it probably surprised her. I said I accepted her apology, Not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe never, but acceptance that she was trying to be better. That our marriage was broken beyond repair, that we would never be friends or even cordial beyond basic co-parenting. But that I no longer wished her ill. I wished her peace, that she would build a better life, that she would learn from her mistakes, just far away from me and my children. Rebecca wept silently on the other end of the line. She thanked me, said it was more than she deserved. We agreed to end the call, return to our usual arrangement of limited communication, focused only on the children. As I hung up, I realized something. The conversation hadn't hurt me the way it would have 6 months ago. The wound was truly healing. I would always carry the scars. There would always be a part of me that was permanently changed by the betrayal. But it wasn't bleeding anymore. I was beginning, very slowly and carefully, to become whole again. Different from who I was before, more guarded perhaps, certainly more cynical, but also stronger, more resilient, more aware of my own worth. That night after Emma and Tyler went to sleep, I sat in the renovated basement, that space that had been completely transformed from a place of betrayal into a place of happy family memories. The blue walls, the gleaming laminate flooring, the shelves full of games and books. There was no trace of Kevin here now, no ghost haunting the corners. I had taken back this space, just as I was taking back my life. I grabbed a beer from the mini fridge I had installed, a small luxury I would never have allowed myself when I was counting every penny. Toasting to myself seemed silly, but I did it anyway. I toasted to surviving, to protecting my children, to exposing the truth no matter how painful, to rebuilding something good from the ashes of betrayal. My phone vibrated with a message from Sarah, my co-worker. She was confirming our dinner for Friday, asking if Italian was okay. I smiled, something I'd been doing more often lately. I confirmed, said Italian sounded perfect. I didn't know where this would lead, if anywhere. But for the first time since that devastating day a year ago, I was willing to try. Willing to trust again, cautiously, slowly, but genuinely. Kevin and Rebecca had taken so much from me, my marriage, my naivete, my ability to trust blindly. But they hadn't taken everything. I still had my children. I still had my integrity. I still had the ability to move on and build something new. As I climbed the stairs to check on the children before bed, I looked at the photos hanging on the wall. I had removed all those that included Kevin or Rebecca, replacing them with new photos of just me with Emma and Tyler. Our trips to the coast, our Friday night pizza dinners, Emma's birthday. A different family now, smaller, broken in certain ways, but still a family. Still strong, still capable of love and laughter and happiness. Emma and Tyler hadn't asked for any of this, but they were surviving, thriving even. Because they had a father who refused to fall apart, who fought for them, who chose truth and accountability over secrets and shame. Kevin would serve his sentence. Rebecca would build a new life in Eastern Oregon. And me, I would continue being a father, continue working hard, continue building a future for my children. The scars of betrayal would never completely disappear, but they no longer defined me. I was more than the victim of my wife's adultery and my brother's manipulation. I was a survivor, a father, a man who had faced the complete destruction of his life and chosen to stand up and fight. This wasn't the ending I had imagined when I married Rebecca 12 years ago. It wasn't the family I dreamed of building, but it was real, it was honest, and it was mine. And in some strange and painful way, that was enough. Emma's bedroom door was ajar. I entered quietly, adjusting her blanket where it had been kicked aside. She murmured something in her sleep, probably dreaming of her birthday party, her friends, the happy moments we were creating to replace the traumatic ones. I kissed her forehead gently. In the next room, Tyler was sprawled out with that utter abandon only children can muster, one arm dangling off the bed, his favorite teddy bear clutched to his chest. I tucked him into bed, tucked him in properly, and watched his peaceful breathing in deep, nightmare-free sleep. My children. My reason to keep going when everything else seemed impossible. I lay in my own bed that night, no longer the room I'd shared with Rebecca, but the guest room I'd appropriated, transformed into my own space. No memories of betrayal here, no ghosts of lies and deceit, just my space, my sanctuary, my place to process and heal. Dr. Morrison once asked me what success looked like to me now, after everything that had happened. It took me time to answer. Success was no longer about the perfect marriage or the picture-perfect family. It was simpler and deeper than that. Success was my children feeling safe and loved. It was sleeping at night without anger consuming my insides. It was being able to trust again, even if cautiously. It was living honestly, without secrets or shame. To that extent, against all odds, I was succeeding. My last thoughts before sleep weren't about Kevin and Rebecca. They were about Emma and Tyler, about Friday dinner with Sarah, about the work project starting next week, about life going on. Marching inexorably forward, indifferent to past trauma, offering new possibilities if you were brave enough to reach for them. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a whole year, I slept deeply and peacefully, without nightmares. Without waking up at 3 in the morning ruminating on betrayal, just sleep, just rest, just peace. And when I woke up the next morning with the Portland sun filtering through the curtains and the sound of my children laughing downstairs, I knew we were going to be okay. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. We survived the storm. Now it was time to learn to live again. Thank you for following the journey of Daniel Carson, a man who lost almost everything due to the betrayal of those he trusted most, but who refused to be destroyed. He chose accountability, truth, and protecting his children above all else. A story about betrayal, justified revenge, and ultimately rebuilding life from the ashes. If you enjoyed it, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel.